All right, it's good to be here. Thank you again, Dr. McCarty and the rest of the Global Studies Department for inviting me here. When I first started, I had kind of two versions of this talk. One was going to be an actual paper, but I know it's late. I didn't want to put you all to sleep. So I have one that's much more interactive that I think you all will engage in. And it speaks to the wider breadth of everything that I do, as opposed to just focusing in on my specific research, which is on historical ecology in the Danish West Indies. So with that said, I'll get started. If you all have questions, we can save them for the end, hopefully, and then sort of engage. So write down any questions you have during the presentation. All right, just to give you all a little bit of background, I'm officially a postdoctoral research fellow at UC Santa Cruz in the Archaeological Research Center. That's where the bulk of my paycheck comes, so that's what pays the bills. In addition to that, I'm co-founder and current president of the Society of Black Archaeologists. And we are a formal nonprofit organization that really started around 8 years ago and became a formal nonprofit last year. We have collaborations with a number of different institutions and really focused around building capacity around the African diaspora, archaeology, and advocating for cultural heritage related to Africa and the African diaspora. In addition to that, I work closely with the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. So I'm also a certified scuba diver, AAUS scientific certified. And that plays into some of the research trajectory and the research that I do as well. And then I work closely with Diving with a Purpose, which runs training programs both for adults as well as youth as young as 12 years old. And then finally, I get a second supplementary paycheck from the Smithsonian, the new African American History and Culture Museum in Washington, D.C. Have any of you all been there to Washington, D.C. to see the museum? We have one, good. I strongly recommend checking it out. It takes at least 2 days to get through it. It's very dense, a lot of history. Make sure you start at the bottom and go all the way to the top. If you leave at the first 2 levels, you'll leave depressed. If you get to the top, you at least have a little bit more inspiration about what could happen and what the future looks like. So check that out. But I work closely with them in the Slave Wrecks project, where we map and document slave shipwrecks all over the world and try to get a better idea and understanding of what that journey was like and sort of what the experiences were like on slave ships. So with that said, the bulk of my talk will focus on these issues. I like to give every talk, especially for students, with a sort of set of learning objectives, so you all know what you guys can get out of this talk. One of them is to comprehend the global impact of the slave trade. There are separate classes on this, so don't expect to have a full understanding of it, but just to give you all some perspective as to how significant the slave trade was and the implications of it, I think is important. To be able to articulate the relationship between ecology and slavery. This is something that is a sort of a growing field in African diaspora studies and in archaeology, but the idea of what were their environmental implications associated with this global slave trade is something important to consider. How is it that archaeologists sort of uncover, document, and interpret slave shipwrecks? I know this is a sort of global group, and there are many different ways we can approach these questions of what life was like during the slave trade, what experiences were like on slave ships. But as archaeologists, we have a unique set of tools to explore from a material perspective. And then an awareness on some of the current issues that are going on around global heritage and around archaeology. Issues of representation and interpretation that I think are sort of important in this current era, and ways that we sort of navigate some of the public images that are associated with the sites that we research and study. I don't think this is going to be on the test, so you don't need to write all these down. But I could be wrong. And then finally, understanding the importance of archaeology in present communities. As an archaeologist, we study, or I study specifically the human past through material culture, but who we study it for is just as important as what we study. And oftentimes it's not just for our own research and for understanding in sort of the global context, but for specific communities as well, which is important. All right, so an outline for the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the transatlantic slave trade to give some perspective. Talk about this idea of a sustainable archaeology and different ways we can think about doing the actual work that we do in the field of archaeology. The relationship between ecology and slavery, again, in the sort of global international impacts of ecology. The slave ship itself, and specifically how we document slave shipwrecks. And then the contemporary issues in archaeology, and particularly in maritime archaeology, which is a subfield, again, within that. So I'll touch on all of these components during the course of the talk. All right, I like to start presentations off with maps because I think that they help to situate a lot of things that we discuss and talk about. This is a map that was created by Professor Joseph Harris, which showed really the global impact and distribution of the transatlantic slave trade over the years. Oftentimes when we focus on slavery and the slave trade, we tend to focus specifically on the West African or the Atlantic slave trade. But actually there was a whole other East African slave trade that in many ways perpetuated much longer and was much more extensive than the Atlantic slave trade that we know. Communities of Africans ended up in places like the Middle East as well as in India and modern day Asia. That's a whole separate site of research that is relatively understudied compared to the West African and the Atlantic component. In addition to that, I'd like to point out that there are areas within Southeast Africa where enslaved Africans were taken. Many would stop off in South Africa and then continue on to the Americas. So it wasn't just a West African trade as it's normally purported and normally talked about, but really was this trade that impacted the whole continent and that impacted several continents outside of it when we think of diaspora. All right. I also like to situate how we got to this current situation of where we are today. Bless you. I saw the sneeze coming. When we think about the sort of global outline, there's this idea of these colonies and these colonial powers and what sorts of countries were controlled by what other colonizing powers. We often think of the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, and to some degree the Dutch. But we rarely interrogate the idea of why is it there are so many Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America and so few in Africa? Do any of you know any Spanish-speaking countries in Africa? I'll give you a hint, there's one. Yes. Equatorial, yes, you're the first person to actually get that right. Equatorial Guinea is the only country where Spanish is the official language. And a lot of that has to do with these treaties that were signed over 400 years ago. So you see here a piece of Brazil was given to the Portuguese, and by and large they got most of Africa and most of the rest of the world. The Spanish kind of took a bet on what they were going to find on this end, and so that's why a lot of these are Spanish-speaking and formerly Spanish colonies. So just something to keep in mind as well. These were treaties between two nations, so you'll find within that the French, the Germans to some degree, the Dutch, and others kind of inserted themselves into this conversation. And by and large, the Spanish and the Portuguese kind of saw themselves as controlling the world and divided it up as so. All right. Thinking about the slave trade, it's also important to think about slave ships and other impacts beyond just the transporting of individuals from one continent to another. So I like to turn to art when we can. This was a painting in 1840 of a situation on a slave ship called the Zong. And this painter heard the story of the Zong and decided to paint this image. The title of it is Slavers Thrown Overboard, the Dead and the Dying. This refers to a slave ship, a British slave ship called the Zong. They had gotten off navigational track and they were running out of water and food supplies. And the captain made a decision to throw all the enslaved Africans overboard to preserve as much food and water as they could. When he showed up at port, they asked what happened, and he gave them a deposition. He said, I had to throw everybody overboard because we didn't have enough water and we had to make it back to port. We made it back to port. And now I'd like to collect my insurance money because all of these people were insured. And people don't really think about insurance and the development of insurance when they think about slavery. But many of the prominent banks that we know of today actually got a start and developed heavily during the slave trade era. And the modern system of insurance that we know today was really built up around not only insuring the ships, but also insuring the enslaved people on board. It became a huge court case and legal battle. There were decisions over whether or not you could actually claim insurance when you actively killed these individuals, and what that would look like in terms of human versus property and insuring individuals versus insuring property. So I also like to put that into perspective as well. We're talking about a large economic system, which is important to keep in mind. All right, so with that said, we covered sort of the distributions of people. We talked a little bit about the economic impact, and there are authors that talk about this much more in depth than I do. But the research I'm specifically focused on is this idea of historical ecology and slavery in the Danish West Indies. The Danish West Indies now are the US Virgin Islands. For any of you who know where Puerto Rico is, the US Virgin Islands are to the east of that, and I focus specifically in St. Croix, which is in the southeast. They were sold by the Danes to the US in 1917. So in 2017, there was this huge centennial commemoration that led to a lot of increased research interest into the Danish West Indies, or now US Virgin Islands. And this work really builds off of previous work that's been done around this idea of plantation slavery and archaeology around plantations. So as an archaeologist, we can ask certain questions that historians can't necessarily get at. Most of the historical records are written by plantation owners and by visitors, mostly coming from Europe. So if you want to learn about the experience of the enslaved people, oftentimes we have to turn to the material culture, and that's where archaeologists come in handy. So archaeologists in the past have turned to plantations to look at things like living conditions for enslaved people under slavery, status differences within plantation communities. So you have some people that may work in the house versus working in the field, living in different situations, different places. You've got relationships of planter dominance and slave resistance. And what does slavery resistance look like? And then there's formations of African American cultural identity. And in what cases do we have retentions of African identity? And in what cases can we make the argument that there's sort of new identities and cultural practices being created as a result of this? Again, you all don't need to know all of these things. I see some bright eyes in the room and scrambling to type. All right, so the bulk of my research takes place on the island of St. Croix, which is one of 3 islands that comprise the US Virgin Islands, or the former Danish West Indies. St. Croix is unique because it was actually owned by 7 different colonial powers at one point in time, including the Knights of Malta, which many people don't really think of or associate as a colonial power, but they did have control over St. Croix for a short period of time. The research here focuses specifically at the estate Little Princess, which was one of many Danish plantations on the island, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But our project is unique in this sense because whereas most archaeology projects sort of try to look at an archaeological question and then expand it out into this global discussion, we took an idea of trying to test out a new approach to do archaeology and then develop the questions out of that approach. And so that approach that we've developed is called sustainable archaeology, or that's the term that we're giving it. And it comes from the World Tourism Organization's definition of sustainable tourism with slight modifications. So it's archaeology that takes into the account the environmental impact while addressing the needs of stakeholder communities and accounting for capacity building within localized industries. Normally when we do archaeological research, it's often said that we're doing this work to answer a specific research question. We get our data, we do our research, we write it up. If we do community engagement, it's usually in the form of a museum or inviting people out to the field, but that's generally where it stops. St. Croix provided a different and unique opportunity because of the environmental significance and impact that's been had on this island. So what does that actually look like? It looks like community stakeholders as partners in the formation of the research design, which is again why we didn't come in there with a specific research question, other than this broad idea of trying to understand what was slavery like under Danish colonialism. The research questions that we began to ask really developed out of interactions with community members and questions that they wanted to see answered at this site. It involves countering the environmental impact of our archaeological work through localized environmental restoration. So we're digging holes, we're cutting down trees, we're making paths to do this archaeological work, and now we have to actively think about what that means. It's the idea that when we're doing archaeological work, we're not just looking and focusing at the cultural heritage and working to be cultural heritage stewards, but also focusing on the natural heritage and how the two are related. And then finally, it involves training local stakeholders in archaeology and heritage practice and creating job placement opportunities for participants. And this is a big one as well because we want to actively think about job placement on an island that has historically had issues with unemployment. The major employer on the island used to be an oil refinery, a Hess oil refinery. When it shut down, roughly 15% of the population lost their job. As a result of that, many people took usually the only job that many communities have. When they lose these major industries, they went into the military and into the National Guard. So we wanted to think about ways that we can actively get young people thinking about careers and jobs on the island. And a lot of this work develops out of some work that's come out of this conversation around community-based archaeology and historical archaeology in terms of asking these critical questions of how do we engage communities in our work and to what extent are we presenting our information versus actually including them as active participants in the process. All right, so this question of ecology and historical archaeology really came about fairly recently. In 2018, myself and my colleague, Cameron Monroe at UC Santa Cruz, organized a conference called Emerging Ecologies, which was specifically focusing on this idea of what were the environmental impacts of slavery and the slave trade. And while we had mostly archaeologists and anthropologists in the room, it was keynoted by a geographer, Judith Carney, who gave her insights and impacts on the various ways in which ecological landscapes were transformed over time. In some cases, it meant bringing foods and importing foreign fauna and flora into islands that had never had these species before. And in other cases, it meant large-scale terraforming or modifying the landscape. In some ways, creating irrigation ditches and trenches. In other ways, actually building household structures and modifying the landscape in that way. In coming through that process, we realized that there were a few things that needed to be addressed. One is, as archaeologists, we normally stay very focused in our research bubbles. So archaeologists talk to archaeologists. We realized if we're actually going to study this question of the environmental impact, we have to branch out. So we're talking to chemists, we're talking to biologists, and more importantly, we're talking about theories that are outside of all of these fields, theories in Black studies, theories in geography, to try to make sense of what we're coming across and what we're seeing in the material record. So from this process, and this is the sort of focus of the monograph and the book I'm working on, is thinking theoretically about what a Black historical archaeology could look like. So whereas historical archaeology looks at the sort of trajectory of environment over time and how it's changed, I think there are some unique aspects of the way in which environment has changed as a result of the slave trade and as a result of the African diaspora being in the Americas. Some tenets that seem to prop up are issues of violences to the land directly associated with violences of the body. So when we're talking about slavery and we're talking about people that are forced to till this land, we're talking about that there's not only physical violences to the individuals, but they are creating violences to the land as well, whether that's clear-cutting forests or other aspects of terraforming. This idea that terrestrial and maritime sites are commingled. Oftentimes we tend to associate environments with trees and terrestrial landscapes, but we ignore the marine landscapes. Or sometimes we treat the marine landscapes, but we treat them as separate from the land landscapes or terrestrial landscapes. And so in those ways, we're talking about bringing those two together in conversation with one another to see how marine resources are used on land, not just for food in terms of fish and shellfish, but actually in housing construction, as you'll see later. And then also how land resources are used in the water, whether it's for boat making or other aspects of water navigation. We also like to think of this idea as natural sites being considered as cultural sites and imbued with a certain level of history and meaning making. So we're talking about culturally significant trees in the case of St. Croix, or specific areas of the landscape that may be considered natural by many standards, but also have a degree of cultural significance. And we find this not just in St. Croix, but we find this throughout the world. And in many cases, people have argued that you find this particularly in certain parts of Africa, where you do find that trees may demarcate the sort of center of a town, or may be planted with the founding of a new town historically. So there's a sort of significant relationship between natural environments and cultural environments. And then finally, there's a need to interrogate how these ideas that come from plantations permeate into the present. So there are ideas around sort of how landscapes are modified, and the idea that to make profit, you have to extract from the land in this sort of extractive way that permeate and create issues that we still see today in the environment. So we want to kind of see ways we can tease this out and think of new futures that we can erase some of these sort of long-held understandings. All right, so some historical background on the site I'm working at to try to address some of these questions. Again, we work at the estate Little Princess, which was an 18th century Danish plantation site. It was occupied from 1749 up until the 1960s, so it operated from slavery through emancipation into the 1960s. The US government actually built a housing project on the island and forced everybody that lived there to relocate to that housing project, which is why it was no longer inhabited then. At its height, the plantation actually included 141 enslaved individuals in the census and over 30 cabin structures that were built in neat rows. The interesting thing about this site, and part of the reason that we chose to work at this site versus other plantations on St. Croix, is because of the level of preservation that was there, and also because of its current use today. So standing structures on the plantation site include the sugar and rum factory distillery, the planter's house, a hospital, overseer's house, a sugar mill, and the enslaved laborers village. And there was a watchtower on the site as well, but that was actually relocated to a local museum site. So in terms of preservation, you rarely get this level of preservation on a plantation site. In addition to that, a lot of these structures on St. Croix have been rebuilt and repurposed, mainly because land is so scarce, and there's so much, these structures were built so well that there's a lot of opportunity for reuse. So actually the hospital and the planter's house have been repurposed as a regional headquarters for the Nature Conservancy, which actually played neatly into our idea of looking at ecology and restoration by working at the site of one of the largest ecological restoration organizations in the country and then in the world. The Nature Conservancy is actually the second largest landowner in the United States, for those of you who didn't know, the first being the US government. So just something to keep in mind, and there's a whole lot of other sort of political issues that go into that in terms of a nonprofit owning massive amounts of land. But I won't get into that right now. The bulk of my research is focused in on the enslaved laborers village. This is the housing complex where they lived. This is the hospital, the planter's house, rum factory, well tower, mill, and the overseer's house. All of these structures are still standing to some degree. With the enslaved laborers community in the village, there was only the remains of 3 structures that were visible. We actually had to cut back through the woods and the bush, and we found another standing structure there as well. So part of the work we're doing is trying to locate the full extent of this occupational space. Our initial research questions involved actually cleaning up the landscape and trying to understand to what degree these housing structures were modified. So one structure actually has a tile floor, as you see here, and this was actually occupied into the 1960s, and then we believe it was used as a sort of trash pit in the 1980s and hadn't been used since then. And we recognize 1980s because we found pieces of a boombox from the 1980s in the refuse pile, in addition to a number of burning events, which we associate with burning trash. We wanted to really explore not just what life was like inside of these cabins, but as you can see, these cabins are fairly small, and they were often 2-unit cabins, so there would be 2 families living in here. So one family would live in this side, another family would live in this side. So they're very small. So actually most of the living experiences occur outside of the house. So we wanted to explore what shared space was like between these units. And to do that, we set aside and did excavations between the houses and came across some very interesting architectural features that you'll see here. We have 1, 2, and 3 post holes that have been dug into the bedrock at this site. And historically, we find evidence of bedrock modification in Taino and Carib sites throughout the Caribbean, but we don't find them in African diaspora sites. So we haven't found archaeological evidence of an actual Taino settlement here, which leads us to believe that these enslaved Africans were modifying the landscape around their housing structures. If that is the case, then this evidence of bedrock modification could signal them either building additions onto their housing structures or building separate housing structures in between the units. We're still not sure of which one of those cases it could be, so we have to do continued excavations to try to understand better, and then to try to understand what the purpose was for building these extensions onto their houses. It could be for cooking, if we find evidence of hearths and cooking, or it could be other means as well. But the fact is they're actively modifying their environments around them to make a home in the places that they find themselves. And this is actually a historic image from the estate Little Princess. That's that hospital that's still standing, and these are the cabins that are there. And we actually believe that one of these is probably that cabin with the tile floor now. That's a modification. This photo was early 1900s, so this is post-emancipation. So these people are officially free, but getting paid slave wages. And we know that because we have some of the records of how much they were getting paid. All right, the artifacts that we have are currently being processed. We have a collaboration with an organization called DAX, which is building this larger international database of archaeological sites and plantation sites related to slavery, so that we can begin to do comparative analyses between plantations. And we can actually start to quantify what differences in experiences and consumption of resources was like in the Danish West Indies versus sites in the French Caribbean or in the British Caribbean. But some of the things we do find, we find coins, we find marbles, we find cowrie shells, which we use as a form of currency in different contexts. And then we find tons of smoking pipe stems, as well as beads and buttons and so forth. Things that we don't find, and these are questions that archaeologists can't necessarily answer, are these more ephemeral artifacts. And these are things that would have been created usually through reeds and plants, basketry in terms of basket making that we find here, the making of saddles for donkeys or mules, and then fishing pods, which would have been made through local trees and reeds. We're not sure to what extent these were being used, but interestingly enough, when we got to the enslaved cabin area, there was a large proliferation of snake grass, which is considered an invasive species, but has been known to be used to actually make forms of rope and twine. So there's a possibility that they were using those, and that continued to grow after they left. So this research we're doing is very extensive and involves many different partners and collaborators. Myself, focusing on the ecological question, but in addition to this, we wanted to make the Estate Little Princess a site where we could actually begin to train more archaeologists and research a bunch of different questions at the same time. So my colleague Ayana Flewellen, who's currently a postdoc fellow at UC Berkeley, she's studying identity and dress through archaeology. So she's looking at beads, buttons, fastenings, and ways that enslaved individuals were dressing themselves. Colleague Alicia Odewale is at University of Tulsa. She's looking at the relationship between rural and urban enslavement in terms of access to resources and what this time period, what it would have looked like operating in those different spaces. We brought in an ethnographer, Dr. Antoinette Jackson, to do oral histories with some of the youth as well as community members. And Antoinette Jackson was actually the regional ethnographer for the National Park Service in this region for a number of years. So she had experience on a number of other islands, as well as in Florida and Georgia. We brought Dr. Alexandra Jones from Archeology and the Community, a nonprofit that she started to teach K-12 archaeology education. And she really helped to develop our one-week archaeological training with youth, which ties into our idea of sustainable archaeology and capacity building. And then we brought on Dr. Bill White. And Bill White has over 20 years of work in cultural resource management. So we really brought him on to think about ideas of job placement and where students can begin to look at creating cultural resource management opportunities on island. In addition to that, he's interested in more contemporary questions of how the Danes are actively grappling with their relationship to colonialism today. So it's a wide breadth of not just archaeology, but ethnography and a number of other areas as well. So looking at historical archaeology and slavery in the Danish West Indies, what are some of the key points that we like to draw from or that are important to keep in mind? One is this idea of sugar production and the ecological impact that has. You're talking about clear-cutting forests, in many cases rainforests. When you clear-cut a rainforest, you reduce the amount of rainfall on the island. That causes a number of ecological impacts. You're also shifting from wind to steam power, particularly in the 1800s. This shift is significant because as they abolish slavery, these colonial governments begin to compensate plantation owners. And one of the means they do that is to switch to steam production, which requires less physical manpower, but requires much more fresh water and much more charcoal for burning. Variation in crop cultivation and use. So now we're talking about monocrop agriculture. We're talking about growing the same crop over and over and over, which leads to extensive soil degradation. In St. Croix, we're talking about the mining of coral reefs in and around the island, particularly for housing construction, because this is an island with very little natural rock other than bedrock. And we find evidence of it in housing construction here. And then we think of genetic modification. I know many of us think of genetically modified foods today as a sort of new outgrowth of the contemporary era, but people have been genetically modifying species, not necessarily in labs, but intentionally crossbreeding species to create types of species of animals and plants that they'd like to see. And one of these is the Senecpole cattle, which is unique to St. Croix and was bred specifically on St. Croix to be more heat resistant than many of the other cattle that were on the island at the time. They still have Senecpole cattle on the island today as well, so if you go to the right place, you can get yourself a hamburger made with Senecpole cattle. All right, so what does this look like archaeologically? How do we study these things beyond just the idea of digging it out of the ground? From coral, we're looking at dating these housing constructions through uranium series dating. And this is work that has been done in Micronesia. They've been able to use it to date structures. They can tell you around what time period this coral actually came out of the ocean, and we can then use that to associate this with time construction for the plantation. So we can see how the plantation developed throughout the years. In addition to that, I'm interested in where this coral mining took place. And to do that, I'm drawing from NOAA bathymetry data. And bathymetry data is really a way that they can sort of map the sea floor in and around the island. So NOAA's done this for the US Virgin Islands, and we have ethnographic accounts and oral history accounts of individuals actually diving for coral off of the island. In many ways, this was tasked to enslaved laborers. Some of them were actually skilled professional divers as well. And again, we talk about violences to the land tied to violences to the body. It's been said that many of these divers were actually, they were free divers. There was no scuba at this time. But they would intentionally blow out their eardrums so they wouldn't have to equalize on their way down. As you can imagine, blowing out your eardrums is not only very painful, but can cause equilibrium issues. So in many ways, this was considered a skilled profession, and it was done through apprenticeship. Not only blowing out your eardrums, but then you also have to be able to hold your breath for long periods of time underwater and dive to deep depths. So this was a skill that was not only used for coral mining, but also used for salvaging ships. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the slave shipwrecks that we look at. So we have actual material evidence of some of the coral mining that took place on the island. This is a site called Monk's Bath in St. Croix, and you can see sort of the groove marks and the cut marks from the mining process. This was done sort of on land, but there's much deeper reefs as well that we believe have been impacted. And we overlaid, or I overlaid some of the bathymetry data onto historical maps to look at a specific site that was referenced in oral accounts for being mined for coral. And we have the historic map on top of a DEM elevation model. And then when we overlay the NOAA bathymetry data, we find that this area here has much deeper depths than the shoreline around it. I believe this was intentionally modified. According to the oral account, they say that the area right outside of the Palms Hotel was modified to accommodate rum runners. Some of you who may enjoy alcohol know of the drink Rum Runner. I'm not talking about the drink. We're talking about rum runners who were individuals that were evading taxes by running their rum directly off of their plantation and not through the formal taxation methods. So to do this, they had to actually modify the landscape around the island so they could get their boats and canoes inland to load them up and then ship them out outside of the purview of the Danish government. When you overlay this on top of a modern day Google map image, we find the Palms Hotel is located here, and you can see the light and coloration here of what is today the more deep elevation of some of that coral mining that I believe took place there. So the idea is this is just one aspect and one piece of the island, but this would have been going on across various areas of the island, particularly for building housing structures, but also modifying it for rum runners. So my work next year at Vanderbilt will explore this more in depth through spatial analyses throughout the whole island. And thankfully, NOAA has mapped the entire island, so I don't have to do that. All right, the other issue I want to explore ecologically is this issue of deforestation and soil degradation. So again, we're talking about increasing and cutting down trees for rum production, but then also rum factories themselves, and what sort of lasting ecological issues this has on the soil. So there's a group of individuals that did a study in Antigua around rum production and soil chemistry, and they found a large presence of heavy metals around the rum distillery. And they associated that, this is contemporary, so these are issues and heavy metals found today in rum distilleries that operated over 100 years ago. You'll find here that you don't find that same pattern. That's because this is measuring for potassium, which is not a heavy metal, but you do find evidence of lead, zinc, and iron still in the soils today around these rum production factories. So these are lasting ecological legacies that continue on. Through archaeobotanical tests, we can get evidence of different types of taxa of wood that's been used to burn. They say deforestation was so bad they were actually importing charcoal from Denmark. And in addition to that, they were burning sugarcane refuse. And for those of you who tried to burn sugarcane, it doesn't burn very well. You get a nice sugary molasses, but you don't get a whole lot of smoke and fire. Also, it's a good way to look at food waste. So we can look at different pollens, phytoliths from plant material, and try to understand what plant foods and plant material these people were consuming. And then a more in-depth study of soil chemistry can give us evidence of soil fertility and degradation over time, as well as the presence of heavy metals. So again, this is the different ways that archaeologists combine with chemists and soil biologists to sort of look at these questions of erosion and soil degradation. But again, we're not just talking about what happened in the past, but how these things continue and persist into the future. So there's a geographer, Catherine McKittrick, that talks about how these plantation futures persist today. And Catherine McKittrick, Michelle Alexander, others have talked about plantation futures in terms of violences to the body, where contemporary plantation landscapes, particularly in the US South, have been converted into prisons. In many ways, I'm talking about ecologically what that could look like. And so we find the continued use and production of rum that still happens on the island, in this case with the Croix rum factory. And the Croix rum factory still makes rum today. The sugarcane is largely imported from areas like Guatemala, so the rum production, the sugarcane production has changed, but the actual making of the rum hasn't. And we find through a number of studies that runoff is a major issue associated with these rum factories. So a 2005 study over a number of years has shown that dark plumes that have been associated with the Croix rum factory actually dissipate westward with the winds and are so significant that you can see them with satellite imagery. And this part of the island specifically has been known for having the lowest diversity of taxa of coral and the lowest diversity of marine life around the island. So it has lasting implications for the marine life and the marine biology. This also was confirmed by a 1979 EPA study, which found that a lot of these plumes were associated with the runoff from rum production. We think about rum production in addition to the fact that wastewater didn't have to be treated until roughly the last 30 years, and we can begin to hypothesize about some of the impacts this would have on the marine biology. But it's not all negative when we think about plantation futures. One thing to keep in mind is the way that indigenous communities, and in this case African communities, are engaging with natural resources on the island. So St. Croix has the largest concentration of baobab trees in the Western Hemisphere. And for those of you who know anything about baobab trees, they're mostly found throughout Africa. So finding them on the Western Hemisphere is very rare. They believe they were intentionally brought over, but it's not exactly sure why, because most people on St. Croix don't actually eat the baobab fruit or drink the juice, which many people throughout Africa do. So it leads us to questions about what the use and significance of it is. At the same time, there's cultural significance tied to it. There's a sort of oral legend or oral tradition that if you walked into a baobab tree, the base of it is hollow. At a full moon, you'd be transported back to Africa. So there's all these sort of oral traditions and legends that stem around certain types of trees. So another part of my project, and probably the last chapter of this monograph, is going to be more ethnographic and looking at sort of ways that communities are engaging with historically significant trees on the island today. This map I actually created with an undergraduate student, but the GPS points came from a nonprofit organization that enacted this big tree project where they mapped big trees around the island and trees that they thought were culturally significant. So growing this database is an objective of mine, in addition to adding oral histories to some of these trees as they're associated with specific events in some cases. And from that, we can begin to think theoretically about how these communities are engaging with ecological questions today, thinking about trees as mnemonic devices or representing something larger than the physical tree itself, and then thinking of the people in the communities as environmental subjects in terms of engaging in sort of conservation practices that exist outside of sort of federal and governmental structures. All right, and this brings us back to the tenets of a Black geography. And I'm not going to go too deep into them again, because I want to get to the interesting part, which is a pivotal shift through this sustainable archaeology process. So in addition to doing the archaeological research, we also have focused on capacity building. And part of that involves training local youth. So we developed this project not only to engage in these research questions, but to engage in a project with the local Boys and Girls Club, where we bring in students from the Boys and Girls Club and give them a week of archaeological training, as well as scuba certification. We found that many people on the island of St. Croix weren't actually diving, and the scuba industry was sort of kept out of their ideas of what job placement could be and could look like. Most of the dive operations, actually all the dive operations, are run by people from mainland US. And at the time we got down there were no Crucians employed in the dive industry. Tourism is the most significant economic driving factor on the island outside of the National Guard. And as a result of that, we thought it was a disservice not to have some type of engagement. In addition to that, we've expanded the project now to include HBCU students through this UC HBCU Grant. So these are students from historically black colleges and universities as we're trying to diversify what archaeology looks like. So last year we brought 4 students. This year we're bringing 6 students, and the project is successful, so 2 of them are actually returning this year as well to do more in-depth research. And that's important because it now allows us to develop college-level curriculum into what's already a high school-level curriculum program. And then the next part of this is also coral reef restoration. So for the sustainability component, we wanted to not only identify these sort of ecological issues, but think of ways that we can address them. These are issues that we didn't necessarily construct, but we find ourselves in and we're trying to actively address. So I currently work with the organization Diving with a Purpose, and we do coral reef restoration in Florida with the Coral Restoration Foundation every summer. And the idea is to bring this down to St. Croix and set up some coral nurseries down there and do more coral reef restoration. We currently have 4 students that we've trained in diving, working with the Nature Conservancy on their existing coral nurseries. But there's a lot of bureaucracy with that. They have to be scientific divers, which is a tall order for younger people. It can be very expensive. So as a result of that, we're hoping to build our own coral nurseries and help to assist with the development and reestablishment of coral reefs around the island. And why coral? Well, coral reefs are over 500 million years old, and they support roughly 29% of marine life. So 29% of marine life is usually around these coral areas. However, 90% of the coral reefs around the world have died in the last 40 years. And that's attributed to a number of factors. Climate change, of course, is the main and most significant one. A 1 to 2 degrees Celsius change in water temperature can have drastic impacts in terms of how these ecological environments persist, and it causes bleaching, which then causes coral reefs to die. I think officially, the current president doesn't allow you to use that term climate change, so we'll say extreme weather sort of incidences. And there's a number of other factors as well that attribute to this. Yeah, y'all don't have to write all these down. I hear the keyboards typing. But one other aspect of it that you all have read about is this idea of hurricanes. And what we do when we find ourselves as researchers in situations and in contexts that are actively changing as a result of, in this case, this global climate change. So we have hurricanes striking the Caribbean. Hurricanes Irma and Maria were probably 2 of the most significant hurricanes to strike in the last 100 years or so. Hurricane Hugo in 1989 was another significant hurricane that many people still remembered on the island. And so there's a sort of historical memory around those 2. But many people were focused on, of course, the lives of individuals that were there, which is significant and takes primacy. But we found that there were few people that were focusing on the cultural heritage and how we can protect and conserve cultural heritage in the face of some of these natural disasters, or unnatural disasters, depending on how you look at them. So one of the things that we're employing is using photogrammetry, creating 3D models of some of these historic structures now, so that when the next hurricane hits, we can do another 3D model or structure of these hurricanes, of these sites, and find specifically what parts of them are being impacted. And then we can begin to develop mitigation practices to begin to conserve and preserve some of these structures. So this is just a test site. These are the enslaved cabin areas at the estate Little Princess. But if it's successful, we can employ this for not just the sites on the estate, but all of the sites on the National Register of Historic Places, and begin to enact management plans that FEMA could potentially use in the future, and other organizations. And so far to date, we've certified 18 youth in scuba on the island. 2 of them are now employed at local dive shops. 3 of them have worked for the National Park Service as well as the Youth Conservation Corps. 6 of them are actually going on a scholarship to visit the Moat Marine Lab in Florida to get an understanding of what marine biology could look like as potential careers. We trained 4 HBCU students. We're on track to train an additional 6 more. And we currently have 2 graduate students pursuing graduate level research, not just here, but also on a free black site in an urban context. So we're expanding the sort of archaeological scope and the research questions that are being asked. And then finally, we have 4 high school students that are now working with the Nature Conservancy and working on their coral nurseries. All right, I have about 10 minutes. So I'm gonna run through some of this discussions of slave ships, so you all can see what that looks like. If you have any questions about that research on ecology, I suggest writing them down, and then Q&A, we can get back to those. I always want to talk about the slave shipwrecks because I think this is an aspect of the work that I'm currently developing that people tend to be more interested in because they like to see people underwater and the significance of the research. So I play this visualization just to show, again, the global significance of the slave trade. This visualization is from a database called the Slave Voyages database. And all of these individual dots are actually known slave ship voyages. If you actually were to slow this down and click on an individual dot, you would get the name of the captain, the ship, details about when it left, how many people were on board, where they dropped off, all of that information. So you can see the proliferation and the growth of the slave trade over the years and then over the decades as well. And this database was recently updated by a researcher at UC Santa Cruz, Greg O'Malley, a historian. So this current database only shows voyages that originate in Africa and end up in the Americas. He's created a whole separate compendium that shows voyages within the Americas. So after they land in a place like Jamaica, where do they go? So this is a huge piece of research that's currently being used. I also like to show the global significance of this because 1808 is the abolition of the slave trade. That's when this visualization stops. And you see how extensive the slave trade was when it was officially abolished in 1808. You can imagine when one country, England, says, okay, the slave trade is no longer allowed to continue. And you've got all these other countries that are continuing this slave trade. So there's a whole other set, and you can actually see here through the visualization, the numbers of exportations and importations into these countries continues to increase. So even though the slave trade officially was abolished in 1808, Brazil is the last country to abolish slavery in 1888. So there's a continuation of slavery and the slave trade way beyond this. Interestingly enough, it's difficult to define what a slave ship is. While the slave trade was an extensive system, in many ways they were repurposing various cargo ships for various construction to engage in this trade. And the construction of these ships varied by country, and it also varied by time period. We also have evidence of not just slave ships as we know them today as these large ships, but they were ships that were used to transport people inland through fresh waterways as well, that weren't necessarily these large ships that we associate with slavery and the slave trade. So this is a very popular visualization of what a slave ship looked like and the ways that it would have been modified. There was a construction of a house on the deck. There was what's been known as a slave deck, which was actually a sort of middle barrier between the deck and under the hull. And what would happen is that they built the second deck so that they could actually get more people on board and fill these ships up to capacity. In addition to that, they created barricados, which were separations. So you'd separate women from boys and men, or in some cases you would separate the enslaved from the actual crew. In addition to that, self-sacrifice or suicide was a significant problem. So people would jump off of these ships to commit suicide so they wouldn't have to be taken into slavery. As a result of that, a number of ships actually constructed nets around these ships to prevent people from being able to jump off. Finally, ships positioned additional sails to funnel wind into these lower levels and lower decks so they wouldn't have to bring them up. Every time you brought this group of individuals up, that's a potential for resurrection on the ship. So they wanted to quell that. There are a number of shipping modifications that allowed this slave trade to continue for a number of years. Copper sheathing developed, copper fastenings, the idea of a tumble home. So this idea of a slanted sort of upper part of the ship right here, you can see. Part of this was created because it allowed the deflection of other cannons if they're getting attacked. It also halted the idea of taking over a ship. So if you have a pirate ship coming up to you or another warship, it's much more difficult to actually jump from one ship onto the other one if the deck is slanted in this way. So these were sort of warship modifications that took place. And then navigational advancements as well, which allowed people to sail both at night and during the day, which allowed them to get from one continent to the other more quickly. So how do we document these ships? I'm going to skip over this video, but this is a very cool video. This is Diving with a Purpose's summer program that we run. It's for youth, mostly 12 years old and above. In addition to that, we have an adult program that's also run. So I participate in this program every year, and next year I will become an instructor. It's open to anybody with scuba certification. There's an application online if y'all are interested in participating in this program. And it's in partnership usually with National Park Service or NOAA, depending on what ship we're recording. They like to have us on board because it allows them to have the capacity to document wrecks that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. All right, I just wanted to wet your palate a little bit. That's a piece of it. Shipwrecks for archaeologists are very different from terrestrial sites. When we map a terrestrial site, we usually go stratigraphically from the top to the bottom. Shipwrecks, however, are more like plane crashes. So when they crash, the wrecking event is spread out. So a lot of the work we do isn't actually digging, it's more so mapping. And we're mapping what remains there. Archaeologically, we find very few material evidence, mainly because, as I mentioned earlier, these enslaved divers that were professionals. The first thing that would happen when a shipwreck occurred is that they would send these divers down to salvage everything that they could. So a lot of the physical material evidence from these wrecks has actually been taken off and often resold other places. The way we identify shipwrecks today mainly, because a lot of the wood has been eroded, is through ballast stones. And these ballasts were usually rocks, sometimes bricks, other times coral, that were used to weigh down the ship to make sure that the buoyancy was level. You would go from these ships having literally hundreds of people on board to having very few people on board. And you'd have to counterbalance that weight with these ballast stones. So when these ships go down, ballast stones are what remains. What we always like to find, but rarely ever find, is the bell. And that's because the bell was like the VIN number on a car, often had the name of the ship engraved on the bell. We find evidence of cargo sometimes, if cargo was still on board. The size of the ship can give us an idea as to what kind of ship it was. The artifacts, sometimes we find beads, manillas, which were a form of currency in West Africa, and ivory. And then documentation is most important. Again, many of these ship captains and insurers tried to claim insurance on these shipwrecks. And as a result of that, the captain or whoever was foremost on the ship was required to give a deposition to describe why it wrecked, where it wrecked, how it wrecked, and what was on board. So we use those from the archives. And then natural disasters ironically reveal new sites for us. While we think of the hurricanes and the damage they do on land, they many times shift tens of feet of sand underwater as well. And in some cases that reveals new sites. In other cases it covers them up. The Chazose was a prominent wreck that's currently on display at the Smithsonian Museum. I won't talk too much about it, but this is some of the work I do with the Slave Wrecks Project, is identifying shipwrecks like these. And through depositional records, they were able to locate where it was off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. And some of the remains that they found include evidences of Shackle, which they were able to identify through X-ray. They're currently looking for another ship, the Clotilda, which was believed to be the last slave ship to come to the Americas. Any of you followed the news? They thought they had found it earlier last year. They sent some historical archaeologists out there and underwater archaeologists and realized it wasn't the ship. But now there's this statewide push to actually look for it. So 100 Africans disembarked on it. Many of them occupy and live in a place called Africatown. There was a book that was just published recently called Barracoon, which was written by Zora and Hurston. And that project is currently underway. And doing this work is important because it causes us to think about slave ships differently. We're not just thinking of them as vehicles to transport individuals, but prisons, warships, sites of manufacture, and in many ways, engaging and changing social stratifications and social networks that existed. So in some cases, there are reports of individuals that were brought on slave ships that are seen to have closer social bonds to their quote-unquote shipmates than they are to people from their same ethnic group. So it's reconfiguring social bounds. And Catherine McKittrick again talks about this idea of spatialized violence, and much of the work that was being done on these ships was about erasing ideas of sociality and ideas of social place and space. And I'm just going to run through one contemporary issue. I'm not going to talk about that wreck, but I'm going to talk about a movie that you all may be aware of, Pirates of the Caribbean. And Pirates of the Caribbean is significant because this is one way we think about wrecks, and that we and the public are engaged with wrecks and piracy. So we think of Captain Jack Sparrow. In this particular movie, I'm not going to play it, he was on board the Queen Anne's Revenge. And the Queen Anne's Revenge was the pirate ship of Blackbeard. For those of you who know, Blackbeard was a real pirate. Queen Anne's Revenge was a real ship. It was actually located off the coast of North Carolina. And as a result of that, it's been interpreted as a pirate ship. But what they don't talk about is the fact that Blackbeard was not only a pirate, but the ship that he captured was actually called La Concorde. It was a French slave ship, and there were enslaved individuals on board. So when he captured it, the first thing he did was he took those individuals from off the coast of St. Vincent, where he captured the ship, to Martinique and sold them off into slavery. So this was a source of wealth for a lot of these pirates. Henry Morgan as well, for those of you who drink Captain Morgan, who are old enough to do that. Captain Morgan owned 3 plantation sites in Jamaica and owned over 100 slaves. So we don't think of these people as slaveholders and actively involved in the slave trade, but piracy and slavery are very much connected. And I'll just end with that because North Carolina African American Historical Commission actually has a grant now to reinterpret the idea of piracy and this particular ship in its role in the slave trade, in the slave trading history. And I'll end with questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.